Welcome back. Chuck Barlow, Cross Gates United Methodist Church, Brandon, Mississippi. High school, Sunday school, open to everybody. Thanks for being here. Hope that you've been able to watch the ones before this. We've gone through the nature of the Bible a little bit. We've gone through the timeline in probably what you think is excruciating detail. And today we're going to jump into the book of Judges on the timeline and start moving forward from there. We've got Faith East here, who's our production expert running the camera. Hannah Bynum, who is, hey Hannah, hadn't seen you in a long time, who is actually in our high school Sunday school class, is here appropriately distanced and is gonna come up and have a word of the day for us at the end of the tape. So let's talk a little bit about Judges. Let me get you where we are on the timeline, especially for those who have not been in the class and weren't in the class last year. Last year we spent a lot of time on Genesis, stories of creation, Adam and Eve, stories of Abraham. We got into the stories of Moses, and then things kind of shut us down. After these stories, the seventh book in the Bible is the book of Judges. So that's where we're going to start today. Think of Judges as a bridge from the time of Moses, when God raised Moses up to lead the slaves, the Hebrew slaves who were in Egypt at that time. He was their leader, dealt with Pharaoh, all the plagues, all of those stories, and then Moses led them out and led them back to their homeland, to the promised land, to what we think of today as Israel. That's what Moses did. Now, once they got there, they came into a land where some people already lived. It was a very rural land. There weren't any big cities, and there were big cities in the world back then, but there really weren't any big cities in this area that we think of as Palestine, Canaan, Israel, whatever you want to call it today. So they had to create their own government. They were trying to create their own country, but remember that at the same time there were some people already there. So there were conflicts, there were battles, a lot of battles. And the book of Joshua, that we really haven't gone into, is before Judges, talks about what is called the conquest. When the people of Israel, the Hebrews, come back into that area and try to carve out a place for themselves, really against the people who were already there. Then you have the book of Judges. So they're there. The people of Israel, the Hebrews, are there, and they're trying to create a place for themselves. Now, about this time in the tape, Faith is going to show a picture of a map. And what this map is going to show you is that the way Israel was governed at this time was really through a very loose confederation of tribes. There were 12 tribes in Israel. They came from the 12 sons of Jacob, and then Jacob's name was changed to Israel by God, and he had 12 sons, and more or less those became the 12 tribes of Israel. So in our brains you might think of this as 12 big counties, but they were loosely connected to each other. They would help each other sometimes, they didn't help each other at other times, but there wasn't a king and there wasn't a central government. What we see in the book of Judges is that God would raise up a person. When there was a crisis, God would raise up a person who the Bible calls a judge. Now, we think of a judge as somebody who decides cases. And the judges in this book of the Bible did settle disputes, it sounds like. And we read that about some of the judges. But it's probably even more important that they were military leaders of one type or another. So here's what would happen in the book of Judges. Everything would be rocking along okay. Their relationship with God would be okay. And then, for whatever reason, they would decide to start worshiping other gods. They would decide to start worshiping, in particular, gods named Baal, who was a male god, Ashtaroth, who was a female god. These were some of the gods of the people who already lived there, people who we can call Canaanites for this purpose. They would leave God, they would leave the God of the Bible, Yahweh, and they would worship these other gods, worship these other idols. When that happened, God would respond. He would respond usually by raising up an enemy. Could have been Canaanites, Midianites, Philistines. There is a series of them in this book of enemies. And the enemies would take over. And they would, usually for 20, 30, 40 years, they would be in charge of the area. They would make the Israelites, the Hebrews, pay taxes, make them do their work, and almost treat them in a lot of ways like slaves or servants. Then what would happen, and this happens over and over and over through really the rest of the Old Testament, especially in Judges, then what would happen is that the people would say, you know what, we messed up. We messed up by going to serve other gods. We forgot the commandments that Moses gave us, that God gave us through Moses. We need to come back to God, to our God, to the one true God. So they would pray, basically they would cry out to God, and God would raise up a leader, and he'd say, okay, I'll get the Philistines or the Canaanites or the Midianites off your back, and I'll give you another chance. And the judge, and there were several judges in this book, the judge would be the person, the military leader and the kind of community leader and actual judge, who would lead Israel through that period. What normally happened was the military leader, God would raise up the military leader, they'd have a series of battles against their oppressors, whoever they were at the time, and they would win because they had a good relationship with God at that point, and then everything would be okay for about 40 years. The fours again, right? We see the 4,000 years, the 400 years, the 40 days, the 40 years throughout the Bible. In this book, when they say everything was okay for 40 years, we think they probably meant a generation. They kind of thought of a generation being about 40 years in that time. All right, so what we're going to do in the next few weeks, we're going to look at three of the judges. There were several, but we're going to look at Deborah, who was a judge, obviously a female judge. We're going to look at Gideon, and we're going to look at Samson. So today's story is about Deborah. The events happened, like I said, about here. You could say around 1100 BC, so 1100 years before Christ, or when these events happened. Now, we're in the book of Judges, and we're in chapter 4 and chapter 5. This is pretty interesting because when you read chapter 4, what you get is a story told kind of in plain English. Of course, it was written in Hebrew, but when we read it in plain English, a narrative, just like you're reading a story of the battles that Deborah, the judge, and some other characters were involved in. When you go into chapter 5, you get the same story, but it's in poetry. Now, and it's the same story. Some of the information's different, but it's obviously the same story, but it's in poetry. One thing that you'll learn as you go through the Old Testament is that when that happens, the poetry is usually older. If you think about these stories having been oral traditions, having been stories that people told and told and told, how did people used to do that? Well, they did it in poetry. You think of Homer, you think of Beowulf, you think of the great epics of literature. They're poetry. I guess they were easier to remember, to recite, and they were usually handed down in some sort of verse like that. So we think that chapter 5 is actually, and I've read, that chapter 5 may actually be one of the oldest chapters in the entire Hebrew Scriptures. But the narrative version in chapter 4 was probably written way down here about 550 BC. So you've got chapter 5, the poem, probably written about when the events happened. And then you've got the narrative version, probably written way down here in about 550 BC. Now, very quickly, think about what's going on. When this guy writes chapter 4, think about a little bit about what's going on in his life. Well, if it's 550 BC, he's a slave. He's a slave in Babylon. And if you remember last week we talked about the timeline, the country of Israel split and the southern kingdom was taken over in about 586 or 587 by Babylon, and they were taken away as slaves, and that's called the exile. So this guy, usually called the Deuteronomist, who we think pulled this together and wrote this down, especially we're talking about chapter 4 here, would have been doing it probably sitting in Babylon as a slave, thinking back over the history of his country and thinking, we got to get back there. And they did get back there. But he's probably thinking, we got to get back there. And you know what we need right now? We need some heroes. We need to remember that even though we're sitting here as slaves in Babylon, at one time we had heroes. We had military heroes. We had kings. We had these great judges. And so he starts telling these stories. He starts pulling these stories together about these military victories. Now, this is one of them. So we're going to read the story of Deborah. And I will go very quickly through some of the characters for you, just because then I'm just going to read it and tell you a little bit about some of the verses. It's only a chapter. We're only going to read chapter 4 today. We might do kind of an advanced video later about chapter 5, but it's poetry, and you kind of have to really, it's not for everybody. It's a beautiful poem. It's great. In places, it sounds very much like the Iliad, actually, by Homer. But it's, anyway, that might be an advanced video. So here are our characters. We have two, the Bible calls them Canaanites, people who were living in the area. Jabin, the local king, called the king of Canaan, and Sisera, his general, his military general. And then on the Hebrew side, or the Israeli side, Hebrew side, you have Deborah. She's the prophet. The Bible calls her a prophetess. She is a female prophet. That means she has a very special relationship with God, and that God will tell her what to do at certain times, what's going to happen, and what to do to make good things happen. So she was the prophet and the judge. The Bible also tells us that she did decide cases between the people. Barak, it's pronounced a lot of different ways. The best pronunciation I could find in Hebrew was Barak, so forgive me if that's wrong. He was the Hebrew general. He was from one of the tribes, and he was the general who pulled people together to fight this particular battle. And then you have a woman named Jael or Yael. If you see it today, you'll probably see it with a Y, Y-A-E-L, woman's name, not an unusual woman's name in Israel, actually. And she was a Kenite woman, and I'll tell you, the Kenites were kind of a group aligned with the Hebrews, friends of the Hebrews. So let's just go ahead and read it. So in your Bibles, this is Judges, and this is chapter 4. Now, I read out of the New American Standard Bible. Excuse me, it should be pretty close to whatever you've got at hand. Chapter 4. Then the sons of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord. After Ehud died, Ehud had been a judge. Ehud died, everything had been okay, and then they go right back into this cycle of worshiping Baal, of worshiping Ashtaroth, of violating the first commandment, to worship no one other than God. The sons of Israel again did evil in the sight of the Lord after Ehud died, and the Lord sold them into the hand of Jabin, king of Canaan, who reigned in Hazor, and the commander of his army was Sisera, who lived in Harosheth Hagoyim. So they were basically like slaves. They had to pay taxes, they had to pay tributes, they had to do what these Canaanite folks told them to do. The sons of Israel, so this was kind of after several years, verse 3, the sons of Israel cried to the Lord, for he, the king, Jabin and Sisera, he had 900 iron chariots, and he oppressed the sons of Israel severely for 20 years. Now, chariots. Well-equipped armies had chariots. The Hebrews didn't have any chariots. As you read in chapter 5, you'll find out the Hebrews hardly had swords and shields. They were very ill-equipped in this loose confederacy of counties or tribes that they had. They didn't have a king. They didn't really have a standing army. So for them to go up and fight against somebody who had 900 chariots, a very daunting task. Verse 4, now Deborah, a prophetess, the wife of Lapidoth, was judging Israel at the time. She used to sit under the palm tree of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim, and the sons of Israel came up to her for judgment. Now she sent and summoned Barak, the son of Abinoam and Kadesh Naphtali, and said to him, Behold, now this is Deborah, the judge, talking to Barak, the kind of military leader. Behold, the Lord, the God of Israel, has commanded, Go and march to Mount Tabor, and take with you 10,000 men from the sons of Naphtali and the sons of Zebulun. Those are two of the tribes. You can see their names on the map. I will draw out, this is God talking through Deborah, I will draw out to you Sisera, the commander of Jabin's army, with his chariots and his many troops to the river Kishon, and I will give them into your hand. Now, let's think just a second. Where do chariots work well? Where do you not want to fight against chariots because they work well? A pretty smooth surface, a plain, okay? You don't want to go fight a bunch of chariots unless you've got a bunch of chariots on a nice smooth plain, a fairly smooth surface, a level area where the chariots work well. So what we think this is talking about is that God is saying, I'm going to pull them on out, I'm going to pull them on out until they get to an area where the chariots don't work very well, okay? If you don't have chariots, how do you want to fight chariots? In the hills, because chariots can't go up in the hills very well, okay? They can't work in rough terrain very well. So you try to neutralize what your enemy has, make it not work very well, by we're gonna fight in this river valley, we're gonna be in the hills, okay, something like that. We think that's kind of what was going on here. Verse 8, Then Barak, the man, the military leader, said to her, If you will go with me, then I will go. But if you will not go with me, I will not go. Now, that's probably not Barak being scared as much as him saying, all right, you're telling me God wants us to do this? You're the judge, you're the prophet, Deborah. If you go with me, if you kind of bring the blessing of God with me and the troops, then I'll go. Otherwise, I'm going home. She said, verse 9, I will surely go with you. Nevertheless, the honor shall not be yours on the journey that you are about to take, for the Lord will sell Sisera, now that's the general on the other side, the Lord will sell Sisera into the hands of a woman. Then Deborah arose and went with Barak to Kadesh. Okay, so somehow a woman is going to end up, we think, taking care of Sisera, taking care of the general. Now at this point, you kind of think it's going to be Deborah, mainly because you don't know any other female characters in the story, right? Hold on. Verse 10, Barak called Zebulun and Naphtali, the tribes, together to Kadesh, and then 10,000 men went up with him. Deborah also went up with him. Verse 11, Now Heber the Kenite had separated himself from the Kenites, from the sons of Hobab, the father-in-law of Moses, and had pitched his tent as far away as the oaks in Zanamim, which is near Kadesh. Okay, let me stop there and tell you why that's important. Here's all that's saying. There's this dude, right? There's Heber. He's a Kenite. Now, Kenites were not Hebrews. They were not Israelites. But even since the time of Moses, they had been allies. They had been friends of the Hebrews. So the Kenites at this point, just think of this as a fellow who lives in tents. He's a nomad. And he had kind of moved out away from everybody else. He wasn't a Hebrew, but he was of this group of people. The Kenites go way back, and they were close friends. God even blessed them because they had helped the Hebrews from time to time. So that's just kind of setting you up for the rest of the story. Okay, verse 12. Then they told Sisera, that the Canaanite general, they told Sisera that Barak, the son of Abinoam, had gone up to Mount Tabor. Sisera called together all his chariots, 900 iron chariots, and all the people who were with him, from Harosheth Hagoyim to the river Kishon. Deborah said to Barak, Arise, For this is the day in which the Lord has given Sisera into your hands. Behold, the Lord has gone out before you. So Barak went down from Mount Tabor with 10,000 men following him. The Lord routed Sisera and all his chariots and all his army with the edge of the sword before Barak. And Sisera alighted from his chariot and fled away on foot. Now that could be the end of the story, but it's not. So the army has been routed. The Canaanite army has been routed. Barak has won the day with the help of Deborah, with the help of God. It's so bad that Sisera gets off of his chariot. I kind of like to think of his chariot as getting stuck in the hills somewhere. I don't know. But he gets out of his chariot and he's running. Okay, so the general is running away. Verse 17. Now Sisera fled away on foot to the tent of Jael, the wife of Heber, the Kenite that I just talked to you about. For there was peace between Jabin the king of Hazor and the house of Heber the Kenite. In other words, they weren't fighting. The Canaanites and the Kenites weren't fighting. So Sisera says, hey, I got to hide somewhere. This ought to be okay. These people aren't Hebrews. I ought to be okay here. I'm going to go try to hide in the tents of these people. Jael, the woman, Jael, went out to meet Sisera and said to him, turn aside, my master, turn aside to me. Do not be afraid. And he turned aside to her into the tent, and she covered him with a rug or a blanket. Verse 19, he said to her, please give me a little water to drink, for I am thirsty. So she opened a skin of milk and gave him a drink. Did even better than water. You know, you're an esteemed guest. You're the general. Here, have some milk. And then she covered him. He said to her, stand in the doorway of the tent, and it shall be if anyone comes and inquires of you, and says, is there anyone here? That you shall say, no. Hang on. Verse 21. But Jael, Heber's wife, took a tent peg and seized a hammer in her hand and went secretly to him and drove the peg into his temple. And it went through into the ground, for he was sound asleep and exhausted. So he died. Got it, obviously, right? I mean, you know, you get a tent peg. This is a big a stake, you know, of wood through his temple, and he died. Didn't see that coming, did you? So behold, as Barak pursued Sisera, Barak, is trying to find him. Jael came out to meet him and said to him, come, and I will show you the man whom you are seeking. And he entered with her. And behold, Sisera was lying dead with the tent peg in his temple. Gotta love the Old Testament. So God subdued on that day Jabin the king of Canaan before the sons of Israel. The hand of the sons of Israel pressed heavier and heavier upon Jabin the king of Canaan until they had destroyed Jabin the king of Canaan. And then if you go to the very last verse of chapter 5, it tells you that they had peace for about 40 years. Which is the cycle here, right? So, wow, right? Tent peg through his head. What do we learn out of this story? And I keep telling you that in so many Old Testament stories, what we do is we learn things about the character of God. And I can tell you that, quite frankly, it scares people to read stories like this and think, okay, what am I supposed to get about the character of God out of this? So I'd say a few things to you. One, I want you to think about it for yourself and decide what you think it means. Two, I do want you to remember when this guy was writing and how he was trying to probably bolster his people by saying, you remember when? You remember when we were a nation or trying to get to be a nation? You remember when we had favor with God? You remember when, oh yeah, that time we didn't worship idols and things went pretty well? I think that's what he was trying to say here. So a few things I'd say. One, the first commandment is not optional in God's eyes. The first commandment, you will have no other gods before me. You will not worship idols. That's the first commandment. When God's people stray from that commandment, the commandments in general, bad things happen. Bad things happen with them And bad things even happen to the Canaanites next door. Maybe they get involved. When you do bad things, there are consequences. We've all just got to remember that. God allows there to be consequences. That can be pretty tough, especially if it's a tent peg through the head. But that's the way the Bible works. And we've just got to deal with that. 2, God was obviously doing something special in Israel. He was developing a people who would become, as the Bible tells us, a nation of priests. And as He told Abraham, a group of people who would be a blessing to all of the families on the earth. It wasn't always pretty. It wasn't always easy. But that's what He was doing here. It was that important to God that His people served Him and only Him. And again, He didn't make the first commandment optional. The third thing I'd say, the last thing, and we'll wrap up, is, sometimes we forget how important women are in the Bible. All right? This is a story of a woman who was the prophet, a woman who was the judge. When God came and gave this message and said, okay, it's time for me to get you out from under the thumb of the Canaanites, that message came to Deborah. And it was Deborah who had the belief and the strength and the courage and the guts to go and get the military leader and say, all right, man, it's time to go. It's time to go do what God has told us to do. And then not only that, but who is it that ends up killing the enemy general at the end of the day? It's another woman. It's Yael. So there are, you could go here, and you could go a lot of different ways, and the scholars go a lot of different ways, and that's fine, into feminism, into the politics of sexuality, and a whole lot of things out of this story. But for right now, consideration of time, I'm just going to kind of draw it to a close. But by saying, don't ever underestimate the importance of women in the stories of the Bible. You go all the way, Eve, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and you just keep going. Ruth, Esther, and then you go right on into the New Testament. Martha, Mary, the other Mary, you know what I mean. So don't ever take that for granted. Sure, I guess most of the characters are male, but the women are right there with them. Okay, so word of the day. Hannah Bynum is going to come up, and I'm going to move out of the shot so that we are appropriately distanced, and she is going to give us our word of the day.
The ACT word of the day is ruse, which just means a trick or a deception. And in our story today, we had Yale, who used a ruse. How do you do this? De Gare.
It's G-U-E-R-R-E.
Uh-huh.
That's all right. Keep going. There
Thank
go.
you.
Which means?
Which means a trick of war.
Right. Rue de Guerre.
Yes.
All right. Thanks, Hannah, and thanks for listening.